The early 1960s in America were a time of cultural transition, marked by burgeoning social change and a pervasive sense of optimism. But in the historic, tightly packed neighborhoods of Boston, Massachusetts, that optimism was brutally extinguished by a wave of terror that descended without warning, transforming the city into a landscape of fear and suspicion. This is a story of the Boston Strangler, a killer who preyed on single women in their own homes, defying all logical patterns and overwhelming the city's antiquated police forces. The terror began quietly in the summer of 1962, a subtle, chilling escalation of violence that quickly spiraled into a full-blown public crisis. Boston, a city known for its close-knit communities and brownstone apartment buildings, became a place where trust was a liability and a locked door was a futile gesture. The first known victim, Anna Sleezers, a 55-year-old immigrant, was found strangled in her apartment on June 14, 1962. Her body was discovered with a ligature, a piece of her own clothing, tied meticulously around her neck, often finished with theatrical bow. This signature act, repeated in subsequent murders, immediately signaled the presence of a methodical, sadistic mind. What was initially viewed as an isolated incident quickly multiplied. Over the next 2 years, the killer, dubbed the Boston Strangler by a sensationalist press, claimed the lives of 13 women across various neighborhoods, from the Back Bay to the South End, penetrating the perceived safety of private homes. The uniformity of the attacks, the sexual assault, the use of ligatures, and most terrifyingly, the lack of forced entry, suggested a killer of terrifying cunning and psychological manipulation. He was capable of charming his way past locked doors, often by posing as a maintenance worker, delivery man, or, ironically, a police detective, using the victim's trust as his primary weapon. The constant threat paralyzed the city. Women abandoned their jobs, moved in with relatives, and armed themselves with whatever they could find. Hardware stores ran out of door chains and deadbolts. The police, overwhelmed by the volume and scattered nature of the attacks across multiple jurisdictions, struggled to communicate and coordinate their efforts, leading to a public outcry and a complete breakdown of confidence in law enforcement. The image of the Strangler became an abstract symbol of fear, representing the unknown, unseen evil that could strike anyone, anywhere. This reign of terror, which ended as abruptly as it began in 1964, would become one of the most studied and controversial serial murder cases in history, primarily because the man who ultimately confessed the crimes, Albert DeSalvo, would forever remain shrouded in doubt, leaving the terrifying question hanging over Boston for decades: was the true killer ever definitively identified? The initial phase of the Boston Strangler case, stretching from June 1962 to December 1962, was critical because it established the first victims and definitively unveiled the pattern of strangulation and ligatures that defined the killer's unique and chilling modus operandi. These early murders, often overlooked in the sensationalism of the later, more famous cases, were the blueprint for the terror that gripped the city. The first 5 victims, all older women living alone, showed a disturbing consistency that immediately suggested a single ritualistic killer. Following the murder of Anna Sleezers, the pattern accelerated. Helen Blake, a 65-year-old living in an apartment, was found strangled with silk stockings tied in a bow. Next was Nina Nichols, a 68-year-old, also strangled with a silk stocking. The killer was becoming more confident, his methods more refined, and the fear in the community was palpable. The key signature of the Strangler was the use of a ligature, often articles of the victim's own clothing, such as scarves, stockings, or nylon cords, tied tightly around the neck. In some cases, multiple knots or elaborate bows were utilized, suggesting a symbolic or theatrical element to the crime, a final, sadistic signature left for the investigators to find. This distinct method led reporters to coin the early term, the silk stocking murders, before the Boston Strangler moniker took hold. The lack of forced entry was a second, equally terrifying piece of pattern. In almost every case, the women were found in apartments with locked doors, indicating that they had voluntarily allowed their attacker inside. This suggested that the killer possessed an ability to appear harmless, authoritative, or trustworthy. He was likely a charming or persuasive manipulator who posed as a delivery man, a utility worker, or even a sympathetic figure to gain access. This psychological skill was as much a weapon as the ligature itself, preying on the inherent politeness and trust of the victims. A critical aspect of the early pattern was the staging of the crime scene. Often, the bodies were positioned in specific, undignified poses, suggesting a ritualized act of humiliation and control beyond the mere act of murder. Items of clothing might be deliberately placed or objects moved, leading investigators to believe the killer spent a significant amount of time in the apartment post-mortem. The escalation of the pattern in the early months of the terror solidified the police belief that they were hunting a single, highly intelligent, and organized serial killer who was evolving his methods, but keeping the core elements, the strangulation, the ligature, and the manipulation of trust, consistent. This established pattern would eventually be used both to link the 13 murders together and, ironically, to later cast doubt on the single killer theory when the methods appear to diverge. The tragic events of 1962 and 1963 quickly transcended the police blotter and became a national phenomenon, fueled by the intense and often sensationalist coverage of the media and the creation of the Strangler myth. The phrase the silk stocking murders, the precursor to the Boston Strangler, perfectly captured the terrifying, lurid fascination the case held for the public, shaping perception of the killer into an almost mythical, pervasive entity. The initial, cautious reporting by law enforcement was swiftly overridden by the needs of the competitive Boston press. Reporters, seeking to distill the complex pattern of the murders into a marketable, fear-inducing headline, focused on the most sensational elements: the victim's attire, the sexual assault, and the distinct strangulation method using articles of clothing. The use of silk stockings or nylon ligatures became the indelible symbol of the killer's violence, lending a chilling intimacy and perversion to the crimes that sold newspapers. The shift to the moniker, the Boston Strangler, marked the peak of media-driven mythology. This name was concise, dramatic, and immediately associated the terror with the entire metropolitan area. The media narrative effectively created a single, monolithic figure, the Strangler, even before law enforcement could definitively link all the crimes. This simplification had significant, lasting consequences for the investigation. The relentless and often inaccurate reporting created an environment of mass hysteria. Stories of the Strangler's latest victim, his alleged profile, and police inaction dominated front pages for over 2 years. This hysteria had a palpable effect on the investigation itself. Police were constantly pressured by the media and politicians to produce results, leading to rushed judgments, premature public statements, and the potential for a narrowed focus that might have ignored contradictory evidence. Furthermore, the media's relentless focus on the killer's charming ability to gain entry and the lurid details of the sexual assaults inadvertently contributed to the public's image of a charismatic, yet savage, predator. This mythologizing of the Strangler as a genius criminal made the subsequent introduction of Albert DeSalvo, a known petty criminal and assailant, as a suspected difficult pill for many to swallow, as he often did not fit the elevated, terrifying figure the press had created. The creation of the Strangler myth exemplifies the double-edged sword of intense media coverage. While it ensured the case received national attention and resources, the sensationalism also created a distorted narrative. This powerful, unified public image of a single killer, the Strangler, would later become a significant obstacle to any attempt to introduce the complexity of the multiple killer theory or challenge the finality of Albert DeSalvo's confession. The media created the legend, and the legend, in turn, dictated the public's appetite for the truth. The terror of the Boston Strangler was defined by the killer's careful, consistent selection criteria, which established a distinct victim profile that simultaneously aided the investigation and masked a crucial internal contradiction. The commonalities among the 13 victims, single women, apartment dwellers, and a lack of forced entry, painted a clear picture of a predator preying on vulnerability, trust, and opportunity. The vast majority of the 13 victims were single women living alone in apartment buildings across Boston and its surrounding suburbs. Their ages ranged significantly, from the youngest, Mary Sullivan at 19, to the oldest, Helen Blake, at 65. This wide age range was one of the first and most confusing anomalies in the case, defying the typical narrow age range of sexually motivated serial killers. However, the unifying factor was their solitude and independence. The victims were all in a position where they were likely to be alone at the time of the attack, minimizing the risk of interruption for the killer. They were also chosen for their vulnerability to deception. As single women living alone, they were accustomed to opening their doors to service providers or delivery personnel. The crucial characteristic that defined the modus operandi was a lack of forced entry. In almost every case, there was no sign of a break-in. This strongly suggested that the killer was able to talk his way inside the apartments. This psychological tactic was predicated on the victim's trust or their assumption of safety. The killer likely posed as a figure of authority or service, a detective, a repairman, or even a sympathetic figure, to bypass the security of the locked door. The importance of the lack of forced entry cannot be overstated. It revealed the killer's primary weapon was not brute force, but calculated psychological manipulation. This consistency across the initial, unified profile was the strongest argument for a single killer. However, the profile was far from perfect. The significant age disparity among the victims, combined with the fact that not all victims were sexually assaulted, created internal friction within the investigative team. The later victims, like Mary Sullivan, were significantly younger than the initial set of victims, suggesting either an evolution of the killer's sexual motivation or, critically, that more than one individual might be responsible for a string of murders. The victim profile of the Boston Strangler thus became a double-edged sword. It provided a clear, chilling picture of a cunning, persuasive predator who sought out solitary women. Yet, the subtle deviations within that profile, the varying ages and methods, will become a source of persistent doubt that the unified police response struggled to overcome, ultimately challenging the claim that one man, Albert DeSalvo, was responsible for all 13 murders. The terror unleashed by the Boston Strangler was compounded by a severe crisis of law enforcement, defined by paralyzing interagency conflict and failed coordination that severely hampered the initial investigation. The complexity of the crimes, scattered across multiple jurisdictions, exposed a critical, systemic flaw in the region's ability to handle a large-scale serial murder case, a failure that arguably allowed the Strangler to continue his reign of terror for 2 years. The murders occurred in at least 4 different police jurisdictions: Boston proper, Cambridge, Lynn, and Lawrence. Each of these police departments operated independently, fiercely protective of their own cases and reluctant to share information or resources with other agencies. This jurisdictional turf war was catastrophic. Crucial evidence and potential leads remained siloed within individual departments, preventing investigators from recognizing the patterns of the serial killer that were only visible when all the cases were combined. For example, the murder of Mary Sullivan in January 1964 was investigated by one department, while the earlier cases were handled by others, leading to delayed recognition of critical similarities. Public and political pressure eventually forced the creation of a special task force, but this effort was often insufficient and plagued by infighting, instead of a cohesive unit. The task force was often an uneasy alliance of competing egos and methods. Furthermore, the role of the Massachusetts State Police and the FBI was also initially hampered by the reluctance of local police to relinquish control. This lack of centralized command meant that crucial forensic evidence was not systematically collected, cataloged, or analyzed using a unified standard. In the early 1960s, DNA technology was non-existent, making the careful collection and preservation of physical evidence, such as semen, hair, and fibers, paramount. The fragmented police response led to inconsistencies in crime scene processing, potentially resulting in the loss or contamination of key pieces of evidence that could have definitively linked the killer to all the victims. The failed coordination extended to the crucial area of profiling and suspect development. Without a single authoritative clearinghouse for all the crime scene details, investigators often develop competing profiles, chasing different types of suspects based only on the details of their local case. This fragmentation wasted valuable time and resources, allowing the Strangler to move undetected between jurisdictions. The crisis of law enforcement demonstrated a systemic vulnerability in the era of serial crime. The failure to coordinate, the resistance to sharing information, and the lack of a centralized command structure contributed directly to the terror. It created the perfect operational environment for a cunning predator who simply needed to move a few blocks across a jurisdictional line to ensure his methods and the full scope of his violence remained obscured from those trying to catch him. The narrative of the Boston Strangler took an unexpected and confusing turn with the introduction of Albert DeSalvo, a man whose criminal history was defined by a series of assaults that predated and ran parallel to the Strangler murders, the terrifying Green Man attacks. These assaults and DeSalvo's subsequent arrest for them were the indirect, circuitous path that eventually led him to confess to being the Strangler, creating an immediate and enduring controversy. Before his connection to the Strangler case, Albert DeSalvo was a career petty criminal with a history of sexual deviancy, theft, and assault. His notoriety was tied to a series of brazen break-ins and sexual assaults that targeted women across the Boston area. These assaults earned him the moniker the Green Man due to a piece of green clothing he sometimes wore, or simply the Measuring Man, as he often gained entry by posing as an agent tasked with measuring women for clothing or for a modeling agency. The modus operandi of the Green Man was one of power and intrusion. DeSalvo would gain access to his victims' homes through deception, often tying them up and sexually assaulting them. Crucially, in many of these attacks, he exhibited an unusual characteristic. He would often apologize to the victim as he left and sometimes even untie their restraints, suggesting a psychological conflict between his compulsion for dominance and a fleeting sense of guilt or regret. The Green Man attacks were terrifying, but they did not involve strangulation and murder. They were classified as breaking and entering and sexual assault cases. However, DeSalvo's luck ran out on October 27, 1964, when a woman he assaulted in her apartment provided police with a detailed description. After escaping from the scene, DeSalvo was eventually identified and arrested for the Green Man attacks. It was while DeSalvo was in custody for the Green Man attacks, facing charges related to those assaults, that the unimaginable happened. Under counsel of his attorney, F. Lee Bailey, and during a custodial exchange, DeSalvo began to confess, not just to the assaults he was charged with, but to the 13 murders committed by the Boston Strangler. The connection was tenuous and opportunistic. DeSalvo was already a known sexual assailant, and he possessed the ability to charm and deceive women to gain entry, a key characteristic of the Strangler. The Green Man attacks thus served as a gateway to the Strangler confession. Without his arrest for these separate crimes, DeSalvo might never have been in a position to claim responsibility for the murders. This established a deep, complex, and immediate contradiction. A known assailant for one set of crimes was now confessing to another, far more brutal and systematic series of murders, leading to the question of whether his confession was genuine or merely the ultimate, perverse grab for attention and notoriety by a compulsive confessor. The process that led to Albert DeSalvo's claim of responsibility for one of America's most terrifying crime sprees was not a dramatic breakthrough, but a calculated, psychological sequence known as the interrogation. The path to DeSalvo's shocking confession was engineered not by police solving the crime, but by a combination of legal strategy and the suspect's desperate need for attention, making the veracity of the resulting confession immediately questionable. DeSalvo was already in custody and charged with the Green Man attacks when he first hinted at his deeper involvement. His defense attorney, F. Lee Bailey, recognized the legal precariousness of DeSalvo's position. The strategy was audacious. If DeSalvo could successfully convince authorities that he was a strangler, a murderer, not just an assailant, Bailey could argue that DeSalvo was legally insane and therefore not responsible for his actions, potentially saving him from a long prison sentence or worse. The actual confession took place not in a formal police interrogation room, but under controlled conditions. DeSalvo was housed at Bridgewater State Hospital, a facility for the criminally insane, under the care of Dr. Harry Kozel. He was encouraged to talk, and eventually he confessed the full details of the 13 murders to another inmate, George Nasser, who in turn relayed the information to Bailey. This method of confession, relayed through a third party and not immediately presented to police, immediately raised ethical and legal red flags. To prove the confession's authenticity, DeSalvo was later interviewed extensively by investigators and his own attorney, often using tape recorders. During these sessions, DeSalvo recounted specific, unpublicized details of the crime scenes, such as the exact placement of objects, the color of rug, or the unique items used as ligatures, details that only the killer or the police could have known. These details, allegedly accurate, were the central pillar supporting the claim that DeSalvo was indeed the Strangler. However, the confession was instantly challenged by the circumstances under which it was given. Critics argued that DeSalvo was a compulsive confessor, a narcissist who desperately craved recognition and notoriety. They suggested that the unpublicized details could have been coached or subtly leaked to him through other inmates, such as George Nasser, who had a strong interest in the case, or through careless sharing of police files. The path to DeSalvo's shocking confession was a psychological negotiation, not a clear-cut forensic victory. It created a legal shortcut that allowed authorities to effectively close a terrifying cold case, but simultaneously planted a seed of doubt that would fester for decades, fueled by the highly irregular nature of confession and the suspect's known psychological profile as a man desperate for recognition. The sudden controversial link between Albert DeSalvo and the Boston Strangler murders was largely orchestrated by one of the 20th century's most famous and audacious defense lawyers, F. Lee Bailey. Bailey's intervention transformed the case from a standard sexual assault prosecution into a landmark legal drama, entirely centered on the legal strategy of the Strangler confession. Facing overwhelming evidence for the Green Man attacks, Bailey realized that traditional defense would likely result in a severe prison sentence for DeSalvo. His strategy was a brilliant and highly risky legal maneuver. Instead of denying his client's guilt, he would embrace a much larger, more terrifying truth to argue for a diminished responsibility defense based on insanity. Bailey essentially planned to prove his client was a Boston Strangler, not to secure a murder conviction, but to secure a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. The theory was that the savage, systematic nature of the Strangler murders was clear evidence that DeSalvo was driven by an uncontrollable psychological compulsion and was therefore legally insane, thus mitigating his punishment. The execution of the strategy relied entirely on DeSalvo's shocking confession. Bailey facilitated confession, first through the intermediary George Nasser, and then by recording DeSalvo's extensive accounts of the crime scenes. Crucially, Bailey leveraged a confession against the prosecution. He entered into an agreement that the confession, due to the circumstances under which it was obtained, could not be used as direct evidence in any murder trial. This meant DeSalvo could tell his story, fulfill his psychological need for notoriety, and provide the only direct link to the Strangler case, all while remaining legally insulated from the murder charges. During the trial for the sexual assaults, the Green Man attacks, Bailey's strategy was to subtly introduce the Strangler confession, painting DeSalvo as a man consumed by a terrifying sexual mania. The prosecution, in turn, fought against this narrative, arguing that DeSalvo was highly organized and rational, not insane, as evidenced by his use of gloves and his ability to skillfully charm his way into apartments. Ultimately, the legal strategy of the Strangler confession did not fully succeed in its initial goal of acquittal by insanity, but fundamentally succeeded in its secondary goal, securing DeSalvo's place as the officially acknowledged, albeit never convicted, Boston Strangler. This legal maneuver allowed the state to effectively close the 13 terrifying cold cases without the necessary forensic evidence, providing the public with the answer they desperately needed while creating an enduring, complex ethical problem that would plague the case for decades. Despite the dramatic and highly publicized nature of Albert DeSalvo's confession, it was immediately undermined by glaring inconsistencies. Significant discrepancies between his detailed accounts and the known crime scene details that were kept guarded by law enforcement. These contradictions were the original source of doubt for investigators, forensic experts, and victims' families, casting a long shadow over the claim that DeSalvo was the single killer responsible for all 13 murders. Forensic analysis revealed multiple critical points where DeSalvo's confession did not align with the physical evidence. The Mary Sullivan case. Mary Sullivan, the final victim, was reportedly found with no semen in her body and was strangled with a ligature. However, DeSalvo confessed to both sexually assaulting her and manually strangling her. Furthermore, the crime scene details he provided about Sullivan's apartment were later shown to be incorrect in several crucial ways, including the placement of furniture and objects. The Beverly Simons murder. Beverly Simons was one of the few victims who was also stabbed 22 times. In addition to being strangled, DeSalvo's description of this murder was allegedly revolting but lacked the specificity that characterizes accounts of other victims, leading some to believe he was fabricating or regurgitating details he had heard. Ligature details. While DeSalvo claimed specific methods of using ligatures, forensic reports showed variations in the type of knots used, the materials, and the final presentation of the bodies that suggested different killer styles. A true, unified pattern should have shown greater consistency in the ligature application. A major point of inconsistency was the motive and modus operandi. DeSalvo's own criminal background was defined by non-lethal sexual assaults, the Green Man attacks, where he often apologized and left the victim alive. The Boston Strangler's MO, however, was lethal, systematic strangulation. Critics argued that the difference in violence and finality was too great to be the work of a single, evolving killer, suggesting that DeSalvo was confessing to murders to gain notoriety while relying on details that could have been leaked to him. The police's failure to find any physical evidence, such as hair, fibers, or fingerprints, definitively linking DeSalvo to the crime scenes at the time of the confession further compounded the problem. The reliance on his verbal testimony, despite the inconsistencies, was a pragmatic solution to a terrifying problem. The contradictions between DeSalvo's verbal account and the tangible forensic details are the historical proof that the case was never truly closed by his confession, paving the way for decades of doubt and the eventual necessity of modern DNA technology to search for the final, definitive truth. The controversy surrounding Albert DeSalvo was not confined to legal and media circles. It ran deep within the very institutions that were responsible for the case. Doubts from the inside, candid questions raised by police and psychiatrists, challenged the official narrative that DeSalvo was the sole Boston Strangler, branding him instead as a dangerous but unreliable compulsive confessor. Several key figures involved in the case refused to accept DeSalvo's confession as the final, absolute truth. Ames Roby, the medical director of Bridgewater State Hospital, where DeSalvo was housed, was one of the most vocal critics. Roby, who spent extensive time evaluating DeSalvo, publicly stated his belief that the prisoner was a very clever, very smooth, compulsive confessor who desperately needs to be recognized. Roby recognized DeSalvo's deep-seated need for attention and suggested that his confession was merely the ultimate, perverse expression of this need, fueled by information he could have easily gathered. This psychological assessment clashed directly with the police's desire for closure. Within the police ranks, several lead investigators and district attorneys expressed private, deep reservations. They had worked the case for years, dealing with the complexity of the crime scenes and the internal conflicts, and many felt that the systematic nature of the murders, particularly the age disparities and the variations in modus operandi, pointed toward multiple perpetrators. The ability of the police to definitively link DeSalvo to all 13 crimes using physical evidence was non-existent in the 1960s, forcing them to rely almost entirely on a confession that was legally shaky and psychologically suspect. Even John E. Douglas, the former FBI special agent who pioneered criminal profiling, later expressed his doubts from the inside. Douglas's analysis concluded that DeSalvo fit the profile of a power assurance motivated rapist, the Green Man, who typically seeks to control and assault, but rarely escalates to the systematic, cold-blooded murder of a serial killer. Douglas suggested that the characteristics of the Strangler were more consistent with different and potentially still at large killer. The branding of DeSalvo as a compulsive confessor was a final, devastating internal challenge to the official narrative. It meant that while the police had a convenient answer, a self-professed killer in custody, they lacked the foundational, forensic proof necessary for a definitive conviction. The lingering doubts on the inside ultimately necessitated the decades-long push for modern DNA testing, a necessary step to either confirm the suspicion that DeSalvo was merely a piece of the puzzle or finally silence the critics who believed the true strangler remained free. The official narrative that Albert DeSalvo was a single, monolithic figure known as the Boston Strangler has been consistently challenged by a compelling multiple killer theory, which argues that the 13 murders attributed to the Strangler were, in fact, the work of at least 2 or 3 different individuals operating independently, but using similar methods. This theory arose directly from analyzing the significant discrepancies in the victims and modus operandi that law enforcement initially overlooked or minimized in their rush to close the terrifying case. The central argument for the multiple killer theory revolves around a dramatic shift in the victim profile and the forensic evidence. The 13 victims can be broadly divided into 2 groups, suggesting 2 distinct predators. Group A consisted primarily of older women, ages 55 to 85, who were the targets of the early 1962 murders. These victims were typically killed using a simple ligature and minimal sexual violence. Their murders often suggested an element of rage or, perhaps, opportunistic violence. Group B consisted of younger victims, ages 19 to 25, who were the targets of the later 1963 to 1964 murders, culminating with Mary Sullivan. These attacks were characterized by more extreme sexual assault, often coupled with different type of knotting technique on a ligature, and in one case, the victim, Beverly Simmons, was also stabbed 22 times, a departure from the Strangler's purported strangulation signature. The discrepancy in the modus operandi was critical. The consistency required to attribute all 13 highly violent acts to a single mind seemed improbable, especially since the strangulation methods and the level of staging at the crime scenes varied noticeably. Furthermore, the lack of unified geographical pattern, with victims found across multiple, distant police jurisdictions, also supported the possibility that multiple local predators, inspired by the media frenzy around the Strangler name, were replicating the core technique of strangulation while pursuing their own distinct victim types. The fact that Albert DeSalvo's confession had demonstrable inconsistencies with the crime scene details of several victims, and that he himself was a known non-lethal assailant, the Green Man, lent immense credibility to the multiple killer theory. Critics argued that the police and the prosecutor's office, desperate to quell the public fear and close the most high-profile case in Boston's history, were content to accept DeSalvo's self-professed responsibility for all 13 murders. Even the forensic and psychological evidence suggested otherwise. The persistence of the multiple killer theory became the primary driving force for the later application of modern forensic technology. The proponents of this theory believed that if DNA evidence could exclude DeSalvo from even one of the early murders, the entire foundation of the single Strangler narrative would collapse, forcing authorities to reopen the entire 13-victim case and admit that one or more killers may have successfully evaded justice. Among the 13 victims attributed to the Boston Strangler, the case of Mary Sullivan stands out as the most critical and controversial, functioning as the ultimate battleground for forensic closure. Mary Sullivan, a vibrant 19-year-old who had recently moved to Boston from Cape Cod, was found murdered in her apartment on January 4, 1964. Her death was the last attributed to the Strangler, and specific, unresolved questions surrounding her crime scene were instrumental in both cementing Albert DeSalvo's confession and ultimately leading to his DNA confirmation nearly 50 years later. Mary Sullivan's murder was particularly shocking due to her young age and the brutality of the crime. She was sexually assaulted and strangled with a ligature. Her body was arranged, and her murder marked the violent culmination of a 2-year reign of terror. Crucially, the circumstances of her murder were the ones DeSalvo most often cited, though with significant early inconsistencies, leading many to believe that DeSalvo's memory or knowledge of the crime was flawed. The most significant unresolved question in the decades following confession concerned the physical evidence. While DeSalvo confessed to her rape and murder, the initial forensic report indicated a discrepancy in the sexual assault details. More importantly, the confession was not supported by any direct physical link at the time. This lack of concrete evidence of the last and most public crime left her family and many investigators with lingering, unsettling doubt about DeSalvo's actual involvement. The enduring mystery of the case of Mary Sullivan turned her tragedy into the focal point of the modern forensic investigation. Years after the original case closed, the possibility of re-examining the evidence, particularly biological evidence that had been poorly preserved, became the central hope for those seeking definitive answers. Mary Sullivan's nephew, Casey Sherman, became a key figure in the advocacy, joining forces with others who doubted DeSalvo to push for the application of advanced DNA testing on preserved materials from a crime scene, specifically semen found on a blanket and her body. The reason her case was singled out for modern testing was pragmatic. Her case files and forensic samples were among the few that were deemed viable for modern DNA extraction techniques. The outcome of the Mary Sullivan testing would not only provide justice for her, but would either confirm or deny the entire structure of the Boston Strangler case. If DeSalvo was excluded from her murder, the entire Strangler narrative would collapse, forcing the reopening of all 13 cases. If he was included, it would finally provide the closure that the 1960s authorities could not deliver, making Mary Sullivan's case the key that unlocked the final chapter of the Strangler enigma. The complex controversy surrounding Albert DeSalvo's guilt took a final, irreversible turn with the death of DeSalvo, his own brutal murder in Walpole Prison in 1973. DeSalvo never stood trial for the Strangler murders, having only been convicted and sentenced for the Green Man assaults. His death, a violent, enigmatic end in the relative safety of the prison infirmary, silenced the self-professed killer forever and ensured that the Boston Strangler case will remain trapped in a legal and forensic gray area for decades. DeSalvo was serving a life sentence for the sexual assaults when, on November 25, 1973, he was found stabbed to death in a cell in the infirmary of Walpole State Prison, now MCI, Cedar Junction. The murder was executed with chilling finality. Despite multiple witnesses and an investigation, no one was ever officially convicted of his murder, and the circumstances surrounding his death remain murky, fueling speculation that it may have been an assassination linked to the secrets he held. The immediate consequence of his death was a complete silence of the killer. With DeSalvo dead, the possibility of questioning him further about the inconsistencies in his confession, extracting new details, or even gaining a final, unambiguous admission of guilt or innocence vanished forever. His death meant that the official resolution of the Boston Strangler case rested entirely on a legally inadmissible and psychologically questionable verbal confession. The murder in Walpole Prison only intensified the debate over the Strangler's true identity. Proponents of the multiple killer theory suggested that DeSalvo's murder was potentially orchestrated by individuals who believed he was an informant, or that he possessed information about other crimes, or even the true killer's identity. Furthermore, the theory that DeSalvo was coached by other inmates, particularly George Nassar, was given new, dark dimension when some speculated that Nassar may have orchestrated the death to silence a liability. Conversely, proponents of DeSalvo's guilt suggested his death was simply the result of standard prison violence, a consequence of his notorious status. Regardless of the motive, the death of DeSalvo left the case in a state of suspended animation. Without a living suspect confirmed confession, the pursuit of physical evidence became the only remaining path to resolution. DeSalvo's death solidified the need for the future application of modern forensic technology. It was his passing that, ironically, made his remains available decades later for exhumation and direct DNA testing, an opportunity that would finally, scientifically, speak for the killer who was forever silenced in his prison cell. The prolonged controversy surrounding the Boston Strangler case is in large part a result of systemic investigative failures in the 1960s, specifically critical mistakes in preservation and early forensic efforts that severely limited the ability of future generations to apply modern science to the case. The standard of evidence collection during the Strangler's reign of terror was fundamentally different from today, leading to the loss or contamination of key biological evidence. In the early 1960s, the police lacked the training and technology to understand the immense future value of trace evidence, especially DNA. Consequently, crime scenes were often processed without the meticulous care required to prevent contamination or degradation of biological materials. For instance, objects handled by the killer and the victims, such as ligatures, bedsheets, and blankets, were frequently collected and stored in ways that made future DNA analysis impossible. The mistakes in preservation were manifold. Biological fluids, such as semen found at the scene of the sexual assaults, were often analyzed only for blood type, AB-O, a test that could only exclude a large portion of the population but could never identify a single person. Crucially, the remainder of the samples was often discarded, consumed in testing, or allowed to degrade due to improper storage, not refrigerated or sealed against bacterial contamination. The early forensic efforts were also hampered by the interagency conflict discussed earlier. With multiple jurisdictions investigating the murders, there was no single, unified standard for evidence collection. Different police departments used different methods, and key pieces of evidence were often siloed or not cross-referenced against all 13 crime scenes, preventing the full pattern of the killer from being scientifically compiled. This failure of coordination was a direct contributor to the inability to physically link DeSalvo to the murders at the time of his confession. The cumulative effect of these investigative failures created a situation where, despite the vast number of crime scenes and the wealth of physical objects collected, the final definitive evidence, the DNA, was barely preserved. The task of the modern investigators was not only to solve a 50-year-old cold case, but a fight against a legacy of poor practice. The eventual successful DNA link to Mary Sullivan was a triumph of persistence, achieved only by working with the smallest, most degraded, and often overlooked remaining biological samples. The story of the Boston Strangler remains a sobering lesson in the crucial importance of meticulous, unified, and forward-thinking forensic standards, demonstrating how the mistakes of the past can delay justice for generations. The intense public fear, political pressure, and the desire for closure after 2 years of terror led to a pervasive sense of the conspiracy of convenience. The argument that law enforcement and the state authorities intentionally or unintentionally settled on a single suspect, Albert DeSalvo, primarily because the confession offered an immediate and expedient end to the most terrifying cold case in the state's history. This argument suggests that the focus on DeSalvo became a deliberate tunnel vision that ignored contradictory evidence and alternative theories. The key driver of this alleged conspiracy was the political and public panic. The Boston Strangler had created a public health crisis. The city was paralyzed by fear, and the reputation of law enforcement was in tatters due to a fragmented and ineffective multi-jurisdictional response. The arrival of a self-professed killer, a man who could articulate details of the crime scenes, provided an easy, immediate off-ramp from this crisis. The confession, despite its legal flaws and psychological ambiguity, was embraced as the solution the city desperately needed. Why did authorities settle on DeSalvo? Firstly, his confession provided details that the average citizen did not know, lending it immediate internal credibility. Secondly, his conviction for the Green Man attacks meant he was a known, violent sexual predator with the modus operandi of gaining entry through deception, providing a logical, albeit incomplete, bridge to the Strangler profile. The conspiracy of convenience theory posits that once DeSalvo was identified, the internal doubts on the inside, from psychiatrists and police with the multiple killer theory, were suppressed or marginalized. It was simply easier for the state to manage the public relations disaster of a single, confessed killer who was locked away for other crimes than to admit that multiple killers were operating or that the true killer remained free. The prosecution's decision not to formally charge DeSalvo with the murders, relying instead on his conviction for the sexual assaults and his confession to close the books, is cited as the most glaring example of this convenience. It removed the necessity of a complex, evidence-based murder trial, which they knew they lacked the physical evidence to win in the 1960s. The enduring controversy, therefore, is not just about DeSalvo's guilt, but about the integrity of the process. The conspiracy of convenience meant that the fundamental questions: did a second killer murder the older women? Was Mary Sullivan's true assailant still at large? Were the crime scene discrepancies ever fully investigated? Were pushed aside in favor of convenient, singular answer. This intentional suppression of doubt made the later application of DNA technology absolutely essential for any final claim of justice. The arrival of the DNA revolution in the late 20th and early 21st century provided the first genuine opportunity to scientifically test the decades-old controversy of the Boston Strangler, forcing the reopening of the Mary Sullivan cold case. This modern forensic intervention was not just a reinvestigation, but a direct challenge to the historical narrative built upon Albert DeSalvo's confession. By the 2000s, DNA technology, particularly techniques capable of analyzing minute and degraded samples, had advanced to a point where it could be applied to decades-old forensic evidence. Mary Sullivan's case, the last attributed murder and the one with some of the most ambiguous physical evidence, became the primary target for re-examination. The reopening of the Mary Sullivan cold case was driven by the persistent advocacy of her nephew, Casey Sherman, and others who doubted the official conclusion. They successfully pressured authorities to locate and retest the biological material that had been collected and purportedly preserved from her 1964 crime scene. Specifically, semen recovered from a blanket and her body. The initial DNA testing in the early 2000s yielded results that were initially confusing and inconclusive, failing to provide a clear link to DeSalvo. This only intensified the controversy and strengthened the position of the skeptics. However, technological advancements in YSDR, Y chromosome short tandem repeat, DNA analysis in the following years provided the decisive path forward. YSDR analysis tracks the paternal lineage of a male sample, proving invaluable in cases where the DNA is degraded or only available in trace amounts. Crucially, it meant investigators could compare the crime scene sample not just to DeSalvo's profile, but to the profile of his male relatives. The decision to apply this advanced technology to the few remaining degraded samples marked a watershed moment. It was a formal acknowledgement by the state that the historical conclusion based on confession was insufficient and that only irrefutable science could provide closure. The DNA revolution fundamentally transformed the Boston Strangler case from a historical mystery into a solvable cold case. It set the stage for the final act of the drama, a high-stakes forensic comparison that would either vindicate the skeptics and reopen the entire Strangler case or provide the final, scientific proof that Albert DeSalvo was indeed Mary Sullivan's killer. The success of this reopening provided a template for how modern science can be used to correct the investigative errors of the past. The first successful step toward definitively linking Albert DeSalvo to the Boston Strangler case came through the highly specialized forensic technique of YSDR analysis, which provided a crucial link to the DeSalvo family paternal line. This application of advanced genetic science managed to pierce the 50-year-old veil of doubt surrounding the final victim, Mary Sullivan. YSDR analysis is a forensic technique that examines a Y chromosome, which is passed down almost unchanged from father to son. Every male in a paternal lineage, father, son, brother, uncle, and male cousins, shares the same YSDR DNA profile. This technique is particularly valuable in cold cases because it allows investigators to cast a wide genetic net when the primary suspect is deceased or direct DNA is unavailable. In the reopened Mary Sullivan case, investigators were able to utilize a degraded semen sample recovered from a crime scene and perform the YSDR test, creating a paternal lineage profile of the killer. The decisive breakthrough occurred when police, with the cooperation of law enforcement and through legal means, were able to obtain a reference DNA sample from a living male nephew of Albert DeSalvo. The comparison was stunning and immediate. The YSDR profile from the Mary Sullivan crime scene sample was a direct match to the YSDR profile of Albert DeSalvo's nephew. This provided the crucial link to the DeSalvo family paternal line. The results effectively excluded 99.9% of the male population from being the source of the crime scene sample, but it narrowed the suspect pool to Albert DeSalvo and his close paternal male relatives. While this analysis could not definitively prove that Albert DeSalvo was a killer, as it could have been his brother or another male relative, it provided the necessary probable cause to take the next, most crucial step, the exhumation of DeSalvo's body. YSDR analysis was a scientific catalyst that forced the final resolution. It moved the case from the realm of historical conjecture and verbal confession into the undisputed reality of modern biology, providing the first tangible, physical evidence in half a century that an Albert DeSalvo male relative was at the scene of Mary Sullivan's murder. This definitive link to the DeSalvo family paternal line was the warrant needed to unearth the long-dead confessed killer and secure the final, irrefutable truth. The YSDR match to the DeSalvo paternal line created an undeniable forensic imperative, forcing the final dramatic action, the exhumation of Albert DeSalvo from his grave in Peabody, Massachusetts. This invasive procedure was a final, high-stakes quest for confirmatory DNA, a moment where forensic science directly confronted the ambiguity of history to seek an ultimate, irrefutable answer. In July 2013, with the permission of the family and armed with a court order based on the YSDR evidence, a team of forensic scientists and law enforcement officials proceeded with the exhumation of the body of Albert DeSalvo, who had been buried since his murder in 1973. The objective was clear and singular: to obtain a direct, uncontaminated sample of DeSalvo's DNA to compare it with a crime scene sample and definitively prove or disprove his involvement in Mary Sullivan's murder. The process of exhumation was a solemn and meticulous forensic undertaking. Samples were carefully collected from bone, a femur, and teeth, as these materials are the most likely to preserve viable, uncontaminated DNA after decades of burial. The recovered samples were immediately transferred to a forensic lab for a highly sensitive DNA extraction and analysis process. The successful retrieval of a viable DNA profile from the skeletal remains allowed investigators to perform the ultimate comparison, autosomal DNA analysis, which is a more comprehensive test than the YSDR analysis and can confirm a direct, individual match. The result of this final quest for confirmatory DNA was a long-awaited, definitive answer. The DNA profile extracted from the remains of Albert DeSalvo was an absolute and statistical match to the semen found at the Mary Sullivan crime scene. The statistical certainty was overwhelming, effectively excluding 99.99999% of the male population. This final, irrefutable match, achieved decades after the initial crimes and the killer's death, provided the scientific closure that the 1960s confession never could. The exhumation of Albert DeSalvo was the final, necessary act to solve the case of Mary Sullivan, concluding the controversy over her murder. While the DNA link only proves DeSalvo's involvement in the death of Mary Sullivan, the overwhelming nature of the confirmation led authorities to conclude that he was most likely responsible for the other 12 murders attributed to the Boston Strangler, thus closing the book on the decades-long case, even as the scientific proof for the other 12 remains elusive. The conclusive result from the exhumation represented the final link, the definitive DNA confirmation in the Mary Sullivan murder that formally closed the last, most critical chapter of the Boston Strangler case. This forensic closure marked the end of a 50-year debate, moving Mary Sullivan's tragedy from the realm of controversial conjecture to scientifically proven fact. The autosomal DNA match between Albert DeSalvo's exhumed remains and the semen sample found on Mary Sullivan's blanket established an irrefutable physical connection that had been missing since 1964. This evidence provided the necessary grounds for the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office to announce, in 2013, that they were confident that Albert DeSalvo was responsible for the rape and murder of Mary Sullivan. This scientific confirmation had profound and immediate consequences for the narrative of the Boston Strangler, vindication for case. The DNA evidence finally validated the original investigation's instincts that led them to the Strangler profile, even if they lacked the technology to prove it at the time. Closure for Sullivan family. After decades of public doubt and private agony, Mary Sullivan's family received the final unassailable proof of her killer's identity, providing a sense of justice that the 1960s legal system could not deliver. Confirmation of DeSalvo's confession. While the confession was historically flawed, the DNA proof from Mary Sullivan strongly suggested that at least part of his story was tragically true. Despite this definitive confirmation in the Sullivan case, the full list enigma remains partially unresolved. The DNA confirmation only definitively proves DeSalvo's involvement in the Mary Sullivan murder. No such irrefutable DNA link has been publicly established with the other 12 victims, primarily due to the investigative failures of the 1960s that resulted in the loss or degradation of the other forensic samples. This leaves the door slightly ajar for the multiple killer theory to persist, albeit with less scientific weight. The official conclusion remains that, because of the MO similarities and the strong psychological suggestion from his confession, DeSalvo was most likely responsible for all 13 murders. The final link provided closure for Mary Sullivan and solidified DeSalvo as a key figure in the Strangler murders, but the case remains a complex tapestry of scientific fact and historical ambiguity, serving as a powerful demonstration of how modern forensics can rewrite history and deliver justice, even from the grave. The story of the Boston Strangler concludes not with simple answer, but with the complex reality of justice, doubt, and the unanswered questions. The definitive DNA confirmation of Albert DeSalvo's involvement in the Mary Sullivan murder provided the scientific closure that the city of Boston needed for its most terrifying cold case, confirming that at least one crime attributed to Strangler was indeed committed by the man who confessed. The justice achieved in 2013, decades after the crimes, is a triumph of forensic science, a testament to the persistence of advocates and investigators who refuse to accept an ambiguous conclusion. It stands as a powerful demonstration of how DNA technology can correct the investigative and legal failings of the past, delivering finality to the victims' families who had endured decades of uncertainty. However, the legacy of the Strangler case remains a potent symbol of doubt. The fact that DeSalvo's guilt is only scientifically proven from Mary Sullivan, coupled with the systemic investigative failures and the compelling multiple killer theory, means that a small, persistent voice of suspicion will forever remain. The unresolved questions about the other 12 victims. Did one killer commit all 13, or were there multiple predators operating in the city? Ensure that the Boston Strangler case continues to be one of the most debated serial murder mysteries in history. The case is a sober reminder that even after confession and DNA confirmation, the full truth can remain partially obscured by the passage of time. We call upon state and federal authorities to allocate necessary funding and resources to conduct a complete, renewed forensic examination of the remaining physical evidence from all 12 unconfirmed Boston Strangler cases using the latest in traced DNA and forensic genealogy techniques. We demand the full public release of all non-sensitive, reanalyzed evidence related to the Strangler victims to facilitate academic and private cold case investigation. The closure provided by the Mary Sullivan DNA link must be viewed not as the end of the inquiry, but as a scientific imperative to seek the full truth for all 13 women, ensuring the Boston Strangler case is resolved with complete accountability and dignity for every single victim.